August 1945. In a barracks near Shanghai, these women were shocked when American soldiers didn't even touch them. They had been warned the devils were coming. They braced for the brutality they were promised. Instead, soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division brought them peaches and soap. It was mercy, enforced by a strict non-fraternization order. But as these women began to hope, a different kind of silence was taking root. The official records were being written with a new label for them, a label that threatened to bury the truth of what they had endured forever. What does it mean when an enemy shows you more dignity than the history books ever will? Tell us where you're watching from, and the time. We want to see how far these testimonies reach. If mercy and memory matter, subscribe to keep these stories alive. The heat of August 1945 pressed down on the scorched barracks outside Shanghai, a silence so heavy it felt louder than the war had been. Inside, dozens of women waited. For 3 years, Kim Yun-hee had learned to survive by making herself small, by watching the shifts in a guard's shoulders, by memorizing the sound of boots on gravel. At 22, she was an expert in waiting for the worst. The Japanese officers had fled days ago, leaving behind only their final, chilling warning. The Americans were coming. They were devils, they said, beasts who would do things far worse than anything the women had already endured. Now, the sound of engines grew from a distant hum to a low rumble that shook the tin cups on the shelf. The women huddled closer, their silence a shared prayer. Yun-hee fixed her eyes on a crack in the peeling wall, her body braced for a blow, for a violation she had been trained to expect as the cost of defeat. The war was over for the world, but for them, she was certain the worst was about to begin. A shadow fell across the doorway. A young American soldier stood there, his uniform a different color, his face unfamiliar and tense. He was a boy, younger than she had imagined, and he held his rifle not as a threat, but as if it were a heavy, awkward tool. He was from the 7th Infantry Division, a unit that had fought its way across the Pacific, and the women knew nothing of their reputation other than the propaganda they had been fed. The soldier's eyes swept the room, taking in the cots, the worn blankets, the faces staring back at him in terror. He said nothing. Another soldier appeared behind him, his gaze equally hesitant. They were not the roaring monsters from the stories. They were quiet. After a long moment, the first soldier stepped just inside the door. He did not lunge, he did not shout. He simply knelt and placed 2 small metal cans and a clean-wrapped bar on the dusty floorboards. Then he added a small roll of white bandages. He backed away slowly, his expression unreadable, and then he and the other soldier were gone. For a long time no one moved. The objects sat on the floor, alien and strange. A can of peaches, a bar of soap, bandages. Yun-hee stared at them, her mind refusing to understand. The scent of disinfectant from the Americans' uniforms lingered in the air, a clean smell that was slowly replacing the years of staleness and fear. One of the older women crept forward and nudged a can with her toe. It rolled slightly, the sound echoing in the silence. It was real. Peaches. Yun-hee felt a crack run through the foundation of her world. A thought, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of her fear. Everything we were told about them was a lie. The devils had arrived, but they had not brought torment. They had brought fruit and the promise of cleanliness. It was an act of mercy, so unexpected it felt more disorienting than cruelty. Cruelty, she understood. This, she did not. This single, quiet moment stood in stark opposition to the brutal system that had brought her here. She was one of between 50,000 and 200,000 women, many of them Korean like her, but also Chinese, Filipina, and Dutch, who had been forced into Japan's vast network of military-run comfort stations. It was an organized system of sexual slavery designed to service the Imperial Japanese Army, a bureaucracy of suffering where women were treated as little more than military supplies. They were moved from front to front, their names erased, their pasts severed. Their purpose was to absorb the violence of an army, and they were told it was their duty. They were given just enough food to survive, just enough medicine to remain useful, and a constant barrage of propaganda to ensure they never forgot their place. The propaganda was a weapon in itself. It was designed to build a cage of fear around them, one that would hold them even if the physical walls fell. They were told that the Allied soldiers, Americans in particular, were undisciplined animals who reveled in desecration. They would not just rape, they would mutilate and kill. Surrender or capture meant a fate worse than death. This narrative was drilled into them until it became a part of their reality, the only future they could imagine if Japan lost the war. Legally, these women existed in a gray void. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had laid out protections for official prisoners of war, but they were not soldiers. They were not recognized as POWs. They were civilian women who had been caught in the machinery of war, their status deliberately left undefined, which meant they had no rights to claim and no one to advocate for them. They were, in the eyes of their captors, simply property to be used and discarded. As dusk settled over the barracks, the atmosphere began to change. The paralyzing fear had not vanished, but it was now mixed with a fragile, terrifying hope. A few of the younger women had opened a can of peaches with a sharpened stone, passing the sweet, sticky slices to one another with trembling hands. It was the first sweetness many had tasted in years. The soap was passed around, smelled, and held like a precious gem. Its clean, chemical scent was the smell of another world, one they had long since forgotten. That night, as they lay on their cots in the dark, the whispers started. It was not about the peaches or the soap. It was about the men who had brought them. They did not whisper of monstrous acts or fulfilled prophecies of doom. Instead, a single, haunting question passed from one woman to the next, a question born of profound disbelief and the first flicker of a world turned upside down. Why didn't they? The answer to the women's question was taking shape across occupied Asia, not in whispered conversations, but in typed orders and barked commands. By September 1945, Shanghai had become a city of sharp lines drawn by the American military. For Captain Robert Hughes, of the U.S. Military Police, his mission was clear: maintain order. That order applied as much to his own men as it did to the defeated enemy. In daily briefings, he reminded his MPs of General Order No. 1 for occupied territories, a policy that came directly from General MacArthur's Civil Affairs section. Its rules on non-fraternization were absolute. There were to be no reprisals, no looting, and especially no sexual misconduct. Hughes, a career officer who understood that the first weeks of peace could be as chaotic as the last weeks of war, enforced it with an iron will. His men were not just soldiers, they were representatives of a victorious nation, and their conduct would be judged by the world. When his patrols delivered rations and medical supplies to compounds holding liberated civilian women, the instructions were simple: provide aid, ensure safety, and maintain distance. Any soldier caught violating this order would face a court-martial. The policy was designed to prevent the spread of disease and to deny any potential propaganda to lingering Japanese resistance. But for men like Hughes, it was about something more fundamental. It was about discipline. It was about proving they were better than the enemy they had just defeated. This scene was repeating itself in countless locations. Half a continent away, near Batavia, in the Dutch East Indies, a 28-year-old Dutch woman named Hendrika van der Meer watched a similar scene unfold. Hendrika, a former music teacher, had survived her captivity by clinging to memory and observation, scratching notes on scraps of paper whenever she could. When the Allied soldiers arrived at her camp, she did not see devils. She saw exhausted men who looked just as weary of war as she was. One evening, she wrote a simple entry. They stood at the door. They gave us cigarettes. Then they stepped back. That gesture, the gift, followed by a respectful retreat, spoke volumes. It was a recognition of their humanity, a small but powerful act that affirmed they were no longer property. It was the careful, deliberate absence of a touch that signaled the end of their ordeal. For Hendrika and the other Dutch women, this restraint was the first breath of freedom, a sign that the rules of the world had finally begun to work in their favor again. For the American soldiers themselves, liberation was a moment of profound shock that shattered their own set of myths. Private James O'Donnell, a 19-year-old from a farm in Ohio, had heard the rumors that circulated among the troops. They were told the comfort women were professional prostitutes, volunteers, or even spies left behind to gather intelligence. He and his squad were prepared for hostility, for deceit, for anything but the truth they found. As his unit entered a small, squalid compound, the rumors died on their lips. The women they saw were not collaborators. They were skeletal, terrified girls and women who flinched at the sight of a uniform. They stared with hollow eyes, their bodies curved into postures of perpetual defense. In that instant, Private O'Donnell saw not an enemy, but the victims of an enemy's profound cruelty. He felt a surge of sickness, then a quiet, burning anger. The fatherly lesson he carried with him from home, that real strength was about control, not conquest, solidified into a solemn duty. This was the moment propaganda met reality, and for the American GIs on the ground, reality won. Across the Pacific Theater, this policy of disciplined mercy was being enacted on a massive scale. By the end of 1945, Allied forces had liberated over 30,000 POWs and civilian internees, men, women, and children, from Japanese camps. The official reports from this period are filled with language about strict orders against molestation and the priority of providing medical aid and food. Yet, for the women who had been held in the comfort stations, this relief was not simple. The dignity offered by their liberators was a fragile shield against a deeper, more enduring shame. One evening, as Yun-hee sat mending a torn piece of cloth, she listened to the other Korean women talk. Their hopes of returning home were now tangled with a new kind of fear. Their captors had stolen their pasts. They were terrified that the truth of their captivity would now steal their futures. One of her friends, a girl who couldn't have been more than 18, whispered the fear that haunted them all. "If they tell the truth back home," she said, her voice barely audible, "no one will marry us." Her words hung in the air, a devastating acknowledgement of their predicament. Freedom, they were learning, was not just about being let go, it was about having a place to go back to, a life that could be rebuilt. But if the price of that life was silence, then their liberation would be a prison of a different kind. The brief period of protected stillness could not last. As the autumn of 1945 bled into the harsh winter of 1946, the machinery of peace began to turn, and it was just as impersonal as the machinery of war. The Allied command was faced with the staggering task of repatriating millions of displaced people, and efficiency became the new god. For the women of the comfort stations, this meant being moved again, this time onto trucks, then trains, then onto the vast gray decks of American transport ships. They were processed in centers in cities like Manila, their faces briefly illuminated by the flash of a camera, their details noted on forms by clerks who saw not survivors, but data points. They were given passage home, but little else. They received no official documents recognizing their ordeal, no special status as victims of a systematic war crime, and no compensation for the years that had been stolen from them. While this bureaucratic process was unfolding, a quieter, more sinister effort was underway. In the final days of the empire, Japanese officers had systematically burned the records of the comfort stations, destroying logbooks, transfer orders, and payment ledgers. They were determined to erase the system from history, turning the women's experiences into ghosts, into stories with no proof. On a U.S. transport ship churning through the South China Sea, Yun-hee huddled under a coarse wool blanket given to her by a young GI. He and his friends moved among the women, handing out chocolate bars and cigarettes with a kind of awkward reverence. They did not stare, they did not pry, they simply offered these small comforts and moved on. The kindness felt both genuine and heartbreakingly temporary. One afternoon, a different American, an officer with a clipboard, came through her section. He was working his way down the rows of cots, confirming identities for the ship's manifest. When he stopped at her side, he looked down at his list, then at her. He spoke her name, mispronouncing it slightly, and asked if it was correct. Yun-hee nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He made a checkmark and moved on. The exchange took no more than 10 seconds, but for Yun-hee, it was monumental. It was the first time in years an official in a uniform had asked for her name instead of a number. It was a fleeting moment of recognition, a sign that she was once again a person, an individual with an identity worth confirming. In the vast, uncaring ocean, that small act felt like an anchor, but the anchor did not hold. When they arrived at the processing center, that brief sense of personhood evaporated under the cold light of bureaucracy. The forms used to classify them had no box for what they had endured. There was prisoner of war, but they were not soldiers. There was civilian internee, but their captivity had been of a different, unspoken nature, and so the clerks, following procedure, settled on a bland, sterile category. Yoon-hee saw the words typed on a document that would follow her home. Civilian women recovered. The phrase was a quiet violence. It was technically true. They were civilians, and they had been recovered. But the label was an erasure. It stripped away the context, the cruelty, the crime. It rendered their suffering invisible, reducing years of systematic sexual slavery to a simple logistical event. They were not victims to be healed, but objects to be returned. This official silence echoed in the highest halls of justice. From 1946 to 1948, the Allied war crimes tribunals in Tokyo put Japan's military and political leaders on trial for their conduct during the war. The world watched as prosecutors detailed the abuse of Allied POWs, the mass killing of civilians, and the waging of aggressive war. Justice was sought for soldiers starved in camps and for cities destroyed. But the testimonies of the comfort women were almost entirely absent. The charge of sexual slavery was buried, deemed too complex, too shameful, or simply not a priority. While thousands of Japanese officers and officials were charged with other war crimes, the number prosecuted for the establishment and running of the comfort station system was tragically small, fewer than 20 in total. The only notable exceptions came from local tribunals, like the one in Batavia in 1948, which did sentence several Japanese officers for forcing Dutch women into brothels. But that small flicker of justice only highlighted the vast darkness surrounding the experiences of Korean, Chinese, and Filipino women. Their stories remained in the shadows. A mercy had been shown to them on the battlefield by soldiers who refused to touch them, but now the world itself was refusing to see them. Was a moment of kindness from an enemy a true victory, if history refused to name what you had survived? The journey home was not an end to Yoon-hee's captivity, but the beginning of a different kind. She returned to a village that knew she had been taken, but had no words for where she had been. The questions were never asked aloud, but they hung in the air, in the averted gazes of old neighbors and the pitying looks from women who had stayed behind. The shame she carried was a wall, isolating her more completely than any barracks fence ever had. She married a quiet man who did not ask about the years she could not explain. She raised children, teaching them to be honest and kind, while she herself lived with a profound and secret untruth. For decades, the story of the comfort stations was a collective wound, sealed over with a scar of silence. Across Korea, the Philippines, and China, thousands of women like Yoon-hee grew old, their histories locked away inside them. Their suffering had been rendered invisible by destroyed records and official indifference, and now it was rendered voiceless by a culture that equated their experience with disgrace. The memory of the soldiers who had not touched them, who had offered peaches and soap, became a strange and private truth, a moment of impossible decency in a past she was forbidden to speak of. Thousands of miles away, in a small town in Ohio, James O'Donnell also grew old. He rarely spoke of the war, not of the battles or the fear, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, his mind would return to that sweltering day in Shanghai. He would remember the look on the women's faces, the terror that slowly gave way to confusion. He remembered the strict orders from Captain Hughes and the quiet pride his unit took in following them to the letter. His friends at the local Veterans Hall would trade stories of combat, of islands taken and enemies defeated. But for Jimmy, one of his most vivid memories was of an act of non-combat, an act of deliberate restraint. He remembered being baffled that the rumors they'd been fed were so wrong, and proud that his commanders had insisted on a discipline that proved those rumors false. He sometimes wondered what happened to those women, and why a moment that felt so important, a moment where American soldiers chose mercy over power, was never mentioned in the books written about the war. It was a footnote to a footnote, a small, humane act lost in the grand narrative of victory. Then, in the early 1990 seconds, the silence finally broke. A handful of Korean women, now grandmothers in their 60s and 70s, stepped forward into the light. After nearly 50 years of carrying their burden alone, they began to speak. They testified before journalists and historians, their voices trembling but resolute. They gave names to their captors and locations to the stations. They described the brutality they had endured, but they also spoke of the liberation. Their testimony was an act of profound courage, shattering decades of shame and forcing the world to confront a history it had chosen to forget. For Yunhee, hearing these women on the radio was like feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. Their bravery gave her courage. For the first time, she understood that her story was not just her own, it was part of a history that needed to be told. The silence had not been her fault, and the shame had never been hers to carry. In that moment of reckoning, the true meaning of that first encounter with the American soldiers became clear. The peach and the soap were more than just simple supplies. The act of not touching was more than just military discipline. It was the moment the lies collapsed. The Japanese propaganda had built a prison of fear, describing the Americans as monsters. But a single, quiet act of decency had demolished that prison more effectively than any bomb. The women had expected violation, but they were met with dignity, however brief. They had been told they were worthless, but they were shown a respect that suggested otherwise. That small, human gesture was a victory over the ideology that had enslaved them. It affirmed that a world of rules, of kindness, of basic human value still existed, even if they had not been allowed to live in it for a long time. Years later, an elderly Yunhee sat with a young researcher, her hands folded in her lap, her voice calm and steady. She recounted the long, difficult years of her life with a clarity that left no room for pity. When the researcher asked her about the day of her liberation, her eyes looked past him, back across more than half a century. "The first day we met them, they gave us peaches," she said. "We thought they would take our bodies. They only gave us fruit. I decided then, the world is not as I was told." That small act of mercy did not erase the horror of what had come before, nor did it undo the long silence that followed, but it planted a seed of hope. It was a singular moment when the rules of war were suspended, and the rules of humanity were, for a brief time, restored. In war, restraint is not weakness, it is the truest victory.